and he's given the thumbs up. We are now on recording. I'd like to welcome very much Professor Richard Whitman, who we would like to have had last year, but finally he's here, and we are very, very pleased that he could make it. And together we've chosen this topic, but you'll see, if you've read online, you'll see that he's actually in a very good position to lecture, to talk on these very issues. So before I say any more there, I think I would like to hold this minute's silence and then say just a few more words about Richard. I'd like to, if you feel you want to stand, please do so. Otherwise, the minute's silence, it's to think about during that minute, if you could think about those here in Canterbury who have died or are in an induced coma resulting from the meningitis outbreak at UKC. There's even a case in France which emphasizes, in fact, our proximity to living Europe just across the water. But I'd also like you to think about the Ukrainian soldiers who have died defending not only their country, but also in a wider aspect, Europe and the EU in a much wider aspect. Let's remember that the precursor to the EU was founded primarily as a peace project to end centuries of fighting and wars in Europe. In order that, for instance, young people can live a life without having to feel constantly threatened by the possibility of a war on this continent, as they were doing when they were here partying in Canterbury. I'd like to start the minute's silence and like you to think about those aspects. Thank you very much. Let's now turn to Professor Richard Whitman's talk. Richard is Professor of Politics and International Relations at the Conflict Analysis Research Centre, University of Kent. At present, he's Senior Associate Fellow of the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. His current research, and this is very appropriate, includes the foreign and security and defence policies of the UK and the EU. He's the author and editor of 11 books and published over 60 academic articles and book chapters on European integration and UK foreign and security policy. His book, The UK and the War on Ukraine, Status Seeking in the European Security Order, is due for publication this year. He's also a regular international media commentator. Recent coverage has included BBC Radio and TV, Sky, ITV, CNN, Bloomberg, CNBC, and he's been quoted by print publications including The Economist, the Financial Times, Newsweek, Reuters, the International Herald Tribune, and the Wall Street Journal. He's regularly been called to give evidence to the UK Parliament on UK and EU foreign and security issues. I do apologise. He's been a professor since 2001 at Westminster, Bath, and now Kent. Simultaneously, at present, he's Senior Associate Fellow at the at the RUSI, which I've mentioned, Senior Fellow of the UK in a Changing Europe initiative, and Academic Fellow in the European Policy Centre. Past positions at Chatham House, formerly the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and Director of the Centre for the Study of Democracy. I suspect that I could go on, not quite at the same length of his talk, but there is such an accolade of experience, of expertise and knowledge following all these years of study, research, analysis, and commentary on these matters. It is a real pleasure and privileged for us that Richard is giving us a talk today. So I'd like to welcome him to the stage. Thank you very much.
Your bits. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. The one thing you did miss, which is probably the most significant achievement, is that I was in the dim and distant past the president of the Young European Movement. The very dim and distant past, I have to say. But thank you. That's very kind of you to say so. Thank you very much. It's very nice to have the opportunity to speak at a home fixture as opposed to somewhere else. And I think when Chris and I spoke about what we were going to focus on, I think we had absolutely no idea what the backdrop might be for thinking about the UK, Europe, NATO, and indeed Trump. And in many ways, it's sort of quite difficult to know where to start, I would suggest. And I'm not going to start unless I can move. You may have to click me. The microphone closer. See, I'm a man from Suffolk, so I speak softly. You may have a go, George, see if you can. That's it. Wonderful. I wanted to start with this image, which is not Berlin in 1945, but it's Mariupol in Ukraine today. And I think it is shocking for those of us who associate Europe with being a peace project that we now find ourselves in the situation that we do. And to put it at its most simple, that Europe and Europeans, we're now being confronted with the consequences of two wars of choice that were not of Europeans' own making. The war that Vladimir Putin has waged on Ukraine, which now enters its 5th year, or 12 years if you date it from the 2014 occupation of Crimea. And secondly, and more recently, the Trump-Netanyahu war of choice against Iran, which is having major implications for us as a nation and for Europeans more generally. So we have, a backdrop, which is one that I think that no reasonable commentator could have imagined would have been the situation for Europeans. Certainly at the end of the Cold War, certainly not a situation we could have envisaged, I think, through the 2010s or moving through the last few years, even after Brexit. I mean, a pretty extraordinary state of affairs. And where we find ourselves now, I think, is in a new age of great power politics. We're familiar with Yalta, and Yalta is the moment in which the great powers got together. Now we seem to be in a new great power era, which is sort of metastasizing at a pace that I think most think tankers and commentators are really struggling to get hold of. And it looks like might or authoritarianism is prevailing over the international rule of law. And what has been the major world achievement for Europeans, which is to, in effect, export a model of how you might organize relationships between yourselves by institutionalizing and solving problems through predictable processes of politics. So we're now in an era in which Europeans, frankly, are at a major disadvantage. We're now in an era of European insecurity rather than an era of European security. And Europeans, I think, or I'd suggest to you, are going to have to adapt themselves to what I would call a European way of war. We've had the European way of peace. We've thought about how we guarantee the peace for Europeans. It's had an incredibly powerful hold on our imagination for the best part of 6 decades. But we now have to think perhaps more than we've ever had to think within our lifetimes as to how we might pursue a European way of war, not a way of war which is of our choice, but by necessity to preserve the European way of peace. And one of the reasons we have this sort of current situation of European insecurity is because all the things that were built up that guaranteed our security, what we tend to think about as the European security architecture, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, have disappeared. So all of the structures that we had in place, all of the arrangements that we used to govern our security are no longer with us. And what we've actually ended up with is a situation which is a backwards move in time. And again, I'll come back to that a little bit later. I'm not moving. Maybe George can flick me on. Yep. I can freeze and wait. Here you go. We are, I think I can say this looking around the room, we are children of the Cold War. That we were born in the Cold War, or we lived through the Cold War. We lived through a moment with a product really of where Europe's security arrangements were in the 1940s onwards, determined by the preferences and the predominant power of the 2 Cold War superpowers. Those of us who lived in the western half of the continent, we had a much greater scope to express and perform our preferences in terms of what we wanted to be a part of when we chose to be a part of the US-led Atlantic Alliance. Of course, for those Europeans who were based in Central or Eastern Europe, didn't have that choice, and they fell under the control of the Soviet Union, and so were put in a position in which their security preferences were determined in Moscow rather than by their own nations. And there were a much smaller group of European states, and a group that's got even smaller in recent years, who turned to various models of neutrality to provide for their own security. And with the end of the Cold War, those citizens, those states that were part of Central and Eastern Europe, re-established their own ability to make their own national decisions on how to provide for their own security. And they decided to join NATO, and they decided to join the EU, in many cases on the back of referendums where publics were directly consulted. So what we got at the end of the Cold War was, in effect, a system which had worked very well for Western Europeans was exported to Central and Eastern Europe. But we also accepted as part of that that we were being governed or led, if you prefer, as part of a defense alliance that the United States had the whip hand within. Which is not to say that Europeans themselves didn't have any agency during the Cold War. And in fact, one of the great achievements, I think, of managing our continent were the Helsinki Acts, the Helsinki process that resulted in the CSCE process in the middle of the 1970s. And, oh, I need to go back, sorry. There, in the middle of the 1970s. And we created a set of institutions that allowed us to govern the security space that was Europe, even though there was profound ideological, political, economic disagreement between Western Europeans and Eastern Europeans, and indeed the Soviet Union. And we put in place all sorts of arrangements like arms control agreements, bilateral and minilateral agreements, and a whole set of ways of carrying on with one another that we came to know as the European security architecture. It was quite rule governed, if you think back to where we were and to what we had. And that's a strange thing to say when you think about the Cold War and all the latent tension, the nuclear competition between the superpowers, and so on, and so on. It was a relatively stable system, despite all of that possibility for horrendous conflict between the superpowers. All of that architecture, all of those arrangements have now disappeared. We are very close to having something which is a blank slate in terms of the European security architecture. We have the return of state-on-state war with the war Russia is waging on Ukraine, which we thought was something which had gone away in Europe. Ukraine itself as a country has moved from the periphery of thinking about European security to its center. And we increasingly have to think about Ukraine's security as the central question for European security. And many of the Euro-Atlantic security structures that were put in place during the Cold War survived the end of the Cold War and helped the continent to govern itself in security terms. Things like arms control agreements, which had quite intrusive inspection regimes, for example, on conventional forces, on missile systems, and arms control agreements in general that managed the nuclear weapons or thresholds of the superpowers. How much could they build up? They could build up to. Those have all gone. We don't have any of this anymore. It's an extraordinary condition that we find ourselves in. We used to compare Europe favorably against other regions such as Asia, East Asia, and point to the institutions and the interlocking arrangements we had to provide for our own security, which we no longer have. And we've even had, in some ways, a sort of return to the old script, with NATO in particular, refocusing on Russia as a direct threat to European security, where there'd been an attempt to reach an accommodation with Russia at the end of the Cold War. I've frozen again. You can move me on, George. Thank you. So where does it leave us? Well, we've lost the way that we used to map Europe and European security, and we now find ourselves in terra incognita in terms of what European security might look like. We are, I think there are probably some historians in the room. We're in a kind of interregnum. You know, for historians, interregnums are important points in which we move from one arrangement to another. And for European security, we really do not know what the future map looks like or what it might look like, because Russia, and it is essentially Russia, has chipped away at and violated the security order that we put in place before. And the US now looks like it's walking away from the positive and active role that it played in managing the security of the European continent. There. And really, you know, the great uncertainty that Europeans now face is, what role does the US want to play in European security? This is something that had been alluded to by other predecessors of Trump. Obama and Biden had encouraged Europeans to think much more about their own security. But it's really very indeterminate for us now as to what role the US actually wants to play. And that indeterminacy is probably the new normal. You know, so how are we going to respond to a United States that doesn't look and feel like the United States that we knew in the past, and doesn't play the role that the United States has played, which has been to lead on European security. Europeans, in effect, period of the Cold War and after, did not possess a geopolitical capacity for thinking and for acting. It was outsourced across the Atlantic to the United States. And there are all sorts of ways in which, you know, the US has thought about how it deals with Europe across time. And probably at best, we might be able to say now that the US wants to be an offshore power balancer, which means it doesn't want to be here, but it wants to have a stake and it wants to have a say in the way that our security is managed, but it isn't going to play the same role that it has played in the past. But this is also happening at a moment in which Europeans outside of Russia have engaged in a major sort of tidying up exercise. You know, I mentioned earlier the process that we had where the Western European institutions in effect expanded into Central and Eastern Europe. What's happened now is that through the process of NATO enlargement in particular, through the acceptance of the idea that NATO is an organization that should embrace all Europeans and have the purpose of defending Europeans, we've now got quite a different map in terms of the institutional membership of NATO and NATO states. And this slide is sponsored by Specsavers, I think. But if you take a look, I mean, the dark red is the members of NATO, which we've seen a remarkable geographic expansion since the war on Ukraine, with Finland and Sweden becoming members of NATO. But also we had prior to that big expansion into the Western Balkans as well. You know, Europe now is almost entirely encompassed by states who are members of NATO. The EU is lagging behind a bit in terms of membership numbers. And it's easier now just to look at those bits of the map that aren't members of NATO. So the pool of states which don't want to be aligned is shrinking and shrinking across time. But in many ways, their strategic cultures, their approaches towards conflict have changed quite dramatically. So, you know, Ireland is not as Ireland was, for example, 10 years ago. It thinks about security in a different way. Ditto Austria, and so on and so on. It's great, you know, if you're in favor of, you know, NATO enlarging, you think that's a good thing. You think that it's probably going to make Europe more secure. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't solve the problem of how do you run NATO where the United States is less interested in playing the role that it's played in European security, because NATO works and has worked because of the United States. NATO is an organization that works on the basis of consensus, doesn't have voting. And as we know from the history of the EU, voting or introducing voting is a way that you get round states that don't want to take decisions, and you make much more effective decisions in that way. The United States has played that role, has played that leadership role, and if it isn't there, how's NATO going to work? That's a minor problem, though, in comparison to the big problems that Europeans will face if they have to run their security and defense through NATO, which is that we'll have the NATO command structure. You know, it's the way that NATO takes decisions to fight war, but we won't have the Americans as a part of that. And they've already started to retreat and give up some of the jobs they've had. We won't have their forces and capabilities, probably not in the way that we've had them in the past. And what happens about the core ultimate guarantor of European security, the US extended nuclear deterrence commitment to Europeans? And you may have a simple answer to all of that, which is, you know, let's just park NATO and we'll get the EU to act as an effective replacement for NATO as an organization. It ain't that simple, and we can talk in the discussion as to why it's not. But there are other things going on, which are also perhaps indicators of what our future European security arrangements might look like. The great flavor of the month is what we call minilateralism. Multilateralism are large organizations like the UN, like NATO, like the EU that have large numbers of members. Minilateralisms are organizations that have far fewer members. And there's lots and lots and lots of minilateralism going on at the moment. In fact, there's a sort of golden era of minilateralism in Europe. So we've got things that you may be familiar with, top left on the slide. That's the emblem of something called the Joint Expeditionary Force, which is a British-led military structure that includes 10 Northern European countries. And it is a sort of mini fighting force. It's designed to be a sort of smaller version of NATO, really, but for crises where it can respond quite quickly. There is, at the bottom right, the Nordic Baltic cooperation, which has been given a real boost as a consequence of Russia's war on Ukraine. We've had the emergence of other structures like the E5, which is basically the 5 Europe's largest states, which you can see from the flags. And we've had a sort of revitalization, particularly since the Starmer government, but perhaps before under Sunak, of the E3, which is Britain, France, and Germany. All of these things have really emerged or taken on a lot more salience because of the war in Ukraine. And they are really the search for ways in which Europeans want to talk about their security and defense, because they don't feel they've quite got the setup that they really want. So I think they're manifestations of a political problem that exists. And increasingly, analysts talk about flexilateralism. So we're moving between multilateralism, minilateralism, bilateralism, trilateralism, to try all sorts of different ways to solve the European security problems that we have. And a lot of it is, in effect, muddling through. We're not quite sure what we need, because we're not quite sure what the problem is we want to solve, because we've not quite been sure about, in particular, what the US might be doing for our security. But in effect now, we've got to grow up, or we've been forced to grow up. People in this room will be probably more familiar than me. One of the interesting developments is the way that the EU now talks about defense. I mean, defense was a great taboo for the EU as a political project. Defense in Europe was always NATO, and the EU didn't talk about defense. That started to change a bit with Maastricht, but it's accelerated dramatically, I would say, since Russia's war in Ukraine. But the interesting thing about the EU is the EU does more than military security. I mean, it is what I'd call a sort of multiplex multilateralism. So my apologies for another term. But it does energy security. It does societal security. It does economic security. It does environmental security. It does food security. It does, there's a lot going on. It's like a multiplex cinema. There is a lot of things happening at the same time, contributing to a general sense of well-being and security for Europeans. It's relatively new as a project through which you do defense, traditionally understood. And it's also a contested place to do security and defense. The real dividing line between Europeans is those who still believe that NATO is the thing that should be invested in, and those who take the view that we need to think a lot harder about what the EU might do. That's where we're at. This is not a settled state. I mean, this is real-time negotiation. The exciting things, if you're an EUist, and you get excited about the EU doing more, I'm not excited, but it keeps me in a day job, is that, the EU is just doing things that were simply impossible for the EU to do in the past. It has decided to spend money on sending arms to Ukraine. extraordinary thing for the EU to have decided to do. If you look at its history, it's decided to set up the means to build and supply artillery ammunition for Ukraine. Again, extraordinary. You know, the EU as a project to decide to do this. It's trained the Ukrainian military. And it's not just about Ukraine. The EU's now decided, and this is an incredible sum of money, to mobilize up to 800 billion euro. I mean, I can't even imagine how you could spend 800 billion euro, but the political commitment or the headline goal is to find 800 billion euro for defense. I mean, that is a really extraordinary situation to have moved from not wanting to talk about defense, from putting yourself in a place in which you talk about defense in terms of spending sums of money, which are just impossible for most of us to imagine what that difference might mean in terms of what Europe might look like as a defense actor. To give you some kind of idea, I think the Pentagon figures that it's spending about 200 billion on its war on Iran. That's what they think they're going to spend by the end of the conflict. So Europe could do Iran ×4 if it really wanted to, if it's able to mobilize that kind of capital. But we are really at the beginning of a journey for the European Union as a security and a defense actor. And one of the interesting questions will be, does the EU remain a sort of quite specialist, bespoke undertaking focused primarily on building up the sort of defense and industrial base that makes it possible to produce arms, or will it do more? And I think that won't entirely be the EU's choice, but Europeans are going to have to think about what they want the EU to do and what they want NATO to do, and what they might want the balance to be between the two. Because one of the things with NATO at the moment is NATO is effectively being checkmated by Donald Trump. You know, NATO's purpose is to provide collective defense for Europeans. NATO plays a relatively small role on Ukraine. Actually, I mean, it does all sorts of things to help Ukraine think about security and defense, but NATO is not the vehicle through which Ukraine gets the money that it's using to fight the war that it's fighting. And NATO is not the vehicle through which Ukraine gets the military capabilities that it has supplied by other Europeans. NATO is in this may be a peculiar thing to say, a sort of defensive crouch, in the sense that it's preparing itself for a possible war against Russia, but it's not the place in which it's possible for Europeans to have an honest conversation about the future of their security and defense. Partly because Europeans are on the back foot because Donald Trump has introduced the idea of cash for cover, that you will not be insured for what you thought you were insured for unless you spend more money on your defense. And he's done that in two ways, by saying Europeans have to spend more and setting targets for what Europeans have to spend. But he has also done it in another very sort of interesting, perhaps provocative way, which is to say, if you guys really care about European security and you say that European security is all about Ukraine, that's great, but you've got to pay for it. And so the US role on Ukraine now is to allow Europeans to buy the equipment from the US under a program called Pearl and ship that material to Ukraine. So the US is operating a military cash and carry service where Europeans have to stump up the cash and then carry those armaments in effect to Ukraine. This is not the NATO that I think we've come to understand historically, the role that it's supposed to play. And even worse, to pile on the misery, we have a NATO leading member state that's laid claim to the territory of other NATO members, Greenland and Canada. And we appear to have a Secretary General in NATO at the moment who is interested in running PR the Trump administration rather than thinking about what might be the best interests of Europeans or for the organization collectively. I've sort of pulled my punches on NATO. But I think, I mean, it really is an extraordinary situation if you stand back and think about what NATO stood for as an institution through the Cold War, and now where Europeans actually find themselves. And the fact that sort of US political system and leadership broadly understood in Congress, but also in the what we used to call the military-industrial complex, has allowed itself to be in that place, and in effect to get rid of lots of things that we got used to. So we may have had a dependency in the past in which we relied on the US to provide leadership in NATO, and we thought that was a good thing because all the things the US was contributing, and we signed up to the idea that Team USA was the team that we wanted to be part of. We seem to be losing that within that key organization, but I don't know if you can make this out. We're also changing our relationship to the US to have new kinds of dependencies. One of the things that Europeans have done collectively pretty effectively on the war in Ukraine, which is reduce their energy dependency on Russia, in particular gas. And that chart, if you can see it, is a chart that shows how Europeans have switched from Russia as their provider of gas to the US as their provider of gas. So we are now very, very, very dependent on the United States for LNG. And the United States is able to provide that because the United States has moved from a country that used to have to import hydrocarbons to a country now which is a big exporter of hydrocarbons. Fracking is one of the reasons why it's been possible for the United States to become a major order gas producer. We are now energy dependent on the United States as Europeans to do all the things that we used to do in the past, and we used to do as a consequence of the cheap hydrocarbons that we got from Russia. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, you know, I leave you to judge. But you know, we've swapped one kind of relationship for another, and we're going to have to think quite hard if we have an unpredictable political system in the United States. Is this really what we want to do? Because it doesn't give us the energy security maybe that we might want to have. Now, I've given the US quite a hard time, possibly for good reason. But one of the other things that's happening is you're having quite a lot of renationalization of security and defense in Europe. Lots of European countries, Germany, Poland, and others have really very publicly now started to think about and talk about national security in a way that they haven't for a very long time. You know, look at the process that Germany has gone through in terms of the site and vendor. The commitment of the German government now is to spend on security and defense. It is making a massive commitment in terms of building up German security and defense. Poland, ditto, and I'll show some figures a little bit later. These things may be great in terms of what they add to the collective capabilities of Europeans, but we also know historically that one of the things that's been good for Europeans is to look at ways in which we curtail or integrate our security and defense rather than having it dealt with essentially through national containers. And there is a contest underway for leadership of security and defense in Europe. And a key part of that is what you might call the phenomena of the magic money tree, which we're familiar with in the UK, which is, you know, that governments will claim that they're going to spend very large sums of money that they don't actually have on things that they think they want because they're very good. Good in terms of how the government define those. And that's what's happening in Germany. That's certainly what's happening in Poland. The UK is in a slightly different position in which I think we're sort of probably in a kind of guns versus social security type discussion at the moment, because whatever the government says in terms of what it wants to spend on defense, it isn't doing it, and it's holding back. And we also want to think about the degree to which this kind of nationalization issue is going to come to the fore if we think about France. and the French presidential elections in 2027. We could have a presidency in France that thinks about European security, thinks about French security in quite different ways from the way that France is thinking about security at the moment. And I'll come back to France in a moment. A couple more things, and I'll wrap up if I may. The first is Ukraine. I mentioned earlier that Ukraine is now central to the future of European security. I mean, this is a dramatic reconfiguration of how we think about Europe, where we think of as the sort of fulcrum of European security and the way that we can best secure Europe's security. Ukraine, or the war in Ukraine, was not obviously a war of choice on the part of Ukrainians. It wasn't a war of choice on the part of other Europeans. But what Ukraine has done by force of arms and by its resistance to Russia is actually put itself right at the center of our discussions as to how we secure ourselves and who's central to securing ourselves. And that means that Ukraine, which is outside the two major European institutions, the EU and NATO, is paradoxically probably the most important project for us in terms of being successful in trying to defend and to build the Ukrainian nation and to secure the Ukrainian nation, and not least to secure the ability of Europeans to defend themselves. And I'll come back to that when I finish off. But that's a different way of mentally mapping how we think about Europe. So we've got the US doing, we don't know quite what. We've got NATO doing things that we're not quite sure where NATO might end up. We've got the EU, maybe it will, maybe it won't, in terms of the future of security and defense. We've got individual European nation states thinking about security and defense in a different way. And we've now got Ukraine as a country that we're thinking about in a different perspective from the way we were previously. So that's lots of bits of furniture which are being moved around or are not in a settled state in terms of how we might organize our collective security. Oh, sorry. And we've got, the UK. And where does the UK sit? Well, one of the remarkable things about the UK is the way that the UK has responded to Russia's war in Ukraine. The UK, I think the last three governments we've had have played quite a remarkable role in the support that they've given to Ukraine, diplomatic, military support. This actually goes all the way back to 2014. I mean, the UK, after Russia's occupation of Crimea, was working very closely with the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think to some credit of the governments that were in office from 2022 onwards. But the UK is now in the worst of all possible places, because having decided that Ukraine is so central to European security, the UK has signed a 100-year treaty with Ukraine, a 100-year treaty to commit itself to helping Ukraine with its security. Think back 100 years from now. I mean, 1926, right? We would have signed a treaty with, I'm not quite sure whom. I mean, this is where we're doing Locarno and all sorts of other things. It's an extraordinary timescale. I mean, you do not sign treaties for that length of time. That is a major order commitment on the part of the British government. It has gone all in on Ukraine. It's gone all in on Ukraine now with a US administration that the UK sees itself having, or a country it sees itself having a special relationship with the US that doesn't think about Ukraine in the same way. And the UK challenge has been to hedge that, to say, and we saw this really clearly after that horrendous Oval Office meeting between Zelensky, Trump and Vance. And if you remember, the very first thing, or the thing that happened almost straight after that, was Starmer called that meeting in London to bring Zelensky in to reinforce the idea that the UK was committed to do that, and came up with the idea of the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine if you were going to have a peace process. the UK is absolutely walking a tightrope between what it believes is the key to the future of European security, which is for Ukraine to prevail, and what has been the lodestar for UK foreign security and defense policy since the Second World War, the relationship with the United States. And all credit to Mr. Starmer, he doesn't get much, is that he's played a pretty extraordinary job, I think, over the last little while in trying to manage that. And it is now, I think, for the UK, probably a moment in which it finds itself at the most difficult and potentially dangerous moment for its understanding of its place in the Euro-Atlantic order. And it didn't really prepare for that. I mean, I think the extraordinary thing about Trump 2 and about British governments and Trump 2 is that it probably ranks next to Suez in 1956 in terms of a moment in which you had cognitive dissonance of a British government that just simply did not understand or did not prepare for a US administration that was thinking about the world in an entirely different way, in a way that was hostile to core British interests. You know, it's an extraordinary situation for a British government to find itself in because the US has switched sides. It's no longer that strong supporter of Ukraine. It's seeking a peace, which is a peace to the advantage of Russia. And the problem for the UK is that, you know, traditionally the UK's operated by knowing that it was sort of insecure in the special relationship, because British government spent lots of time worrying about, you know, whether it was special, whether you were going to get the first visit to reach, or for the new US president to reach out, and so on and so on. It's been a major neurosis for British governments across time. If you haven't got that to worry about, or rather, if you haven't got that as a preoccupation and all of the things that come with that, what does the UK want to do? And what does the UK want to do in Europe? And how will the UK square what it wants to do with Ukraine and where it is in Europe? And historically, you know, Britain has tended to lean on what I call promiscuous bilateralism. You know, it's tried to break up the Franco-German relationship, or not to break it up, but to try and build good relationships with France or Germany separately to impose itself. It tried, if you look back over the Blair government period, to work its way around other European states to work around the traditional structures within Europe. It likes flexilateralism. The UK, if you look back, the reports the UK government produces on security and defence, they're all about the bilateral, the minilateral agreements that the UK is plugged into in Europe. It loves flexilateralism, or as they put it in Whitehall, it likes to remain agile. In other words, not to commit, right? And where does that leave the UK in having a really clear, solid vision for its European diplomatic strategy? How does it want to fit in Europe? What does it want to do in Europe? What does it want to contribute to European security? It knows what it wants. It wants Ukraine secure, but it's not quite sure what's the best way to get it. And I think that's quite manifest in the way that the UK, the current government, has approached its relationship with the EU. You think about where we're at. This is a moment in which, you know, the British government and the language that should be used both in Brussels but also in London should be an alliance. We are in an alliance. We're in an alliance because we share exactly the same interests, the same concerns. We're challenged in the same way in terms of our own security anxieties and how we're going to solve those. But we haven't got anything that looks and feels like an alliance. We're nibbling away at the edges. We're talking about whether we're going to have a little bit more of this or a little bit of that, or we might have a few more students and they might pay this and they might pay that. I mean, the big question, how do we secure Europe? What arrangements we need to secure Europe, and how logically the UK and the EU should be in alliance to see the best possible outcome, because the EU is committed to Ukraine. It says that Ukraine is going to become a member. The UK is committed to Ukraine. on the basis of the treaty commitments it signed. But we don't have anything that looks and feels like any kind of arrangement that I think fits with the order of the challenge that the UK government and the EU faces. I keep going backwards and forwards. It's a bit like British governments in Europe, isn't it? Can you move me on from there? Thank you. So, we've got lots of nice photo ops, but, there isn't much, I would suggest, in terms of a real strategic partnership. Even the Security Defence Partnership Agreement the EU and the UK signed, it's just pulled off the word processor. It's the same agreement as exists for other third countries. There's nothing special about it at all. And as I've tried to suggest to you, I mean, in fact, the European challenge now is a back to the future challenge. We're where we were at the end of the Second World War, where we haven't got the security institutions that we subsequently built. We're not sure whether the United States is going to commit itself to European security. I mean, this was the big discussion at the end of the Second World War. That period between the end of the war, 1949, when you got NATO, Europeans just did not know how much the US was willing to commit to their own security. So we are in that very uncomfortable, what has been the most uncomfortable up till now moment for Europeans. And that gets me to my point about the European way of war, that to preserve the European way of peace, the way that we built our continent successfully, the way we navigated the end of the Cold War by extending what was a successful political and economic project across the continent. That's our challenge now. I don't mean that Europeans should think about war as an instrument that they want to use for power and for influence. And that's probably different, what differentiates Europeans from the United States at this moment in time. But it is for Europeans to have to think quite hard about how they are going to prepare themselves to defend their gains, if you like. So to express it simply, I would say, this is actually not a problem for Europeans in the sense we have the wealth. Unquestionably, we have the wealth. We actually have the means to do so. I mean, we do have the armed force structures in place, and we've got a sort of defense industrial base. The question is whether we've got the political capacity or ability, really, to do what we think we might actually want to do. And there's no way you're going to be able to read that. But this is to reinforce my point that that Europeans are perfectly able to defend themselves in aggregate against Russia. Europe does not have to be the United States to defend itself. Europe has to be Europe and have what Europe needs to defend itself against Russia, if you're thinking the major order threat. And in terms of military personnel, in terms of some indicators of military equipment and so on, Europeans have all of this stuff. They don't have a problem in terms of the infrastructure, if you like, that they can build on. They have the means to defend themselves against Russia if Russia is the first order threat for Europeans, and I think it's reasonable to assume that it is. And by Europe, I don't mean the EU, I mean, Europe understood in its broadest sense, which means EU, Europe, NATO, Europe, it means Ukraine, it means the UK, it means Norway, it means Turkey. All of these states collectively have more than enough means to provide for their own security if they choose to do so and if they choose to organize it in a way. And we have the advantage, and it is an advantage, of Ukraine. Ukraine has fought Russia to a stalemate. that's where the war is. Unfortunately, the land war, that Ukraine has been able to hold back Russia would consider itself to be a great power, to hold back a great power on the battlefield, a remarkable achievement from where you think Ukraine actually was. And it's done so partly by changing the nature of war. And Europeans now have that capacity. They have an incubator and a proven set of ways to make it possible to wage war to defend themselves by what we know in terms of how Russia fights war and how Ukraine has demonstrated you can respond to Russia. The challenging thing for Europeans is what we call the strategic enablers. These are the things that the US has, the satellites that the US has, the ability to move people and equipment over quite long distances, the ability to remotely sense and so on, the intelligence infrastructure. The US has all of that. Europeans have these things, but they don't have them to the scale that the United States does. But what scale do they need them to be if you are focused on just one problem? The United States is an imperial power. It's a global power. It thinks about and organizes itself for global influence. In terms of waging war, Europeans only have to think about how they can best defend themselves and what they need to do so. And I would suggest to you that they have. And they have, even in the most difficult area for us to talk about. And you may have seen this speech reported that Mr. Macron gave at Ilongi, which is where France keeps its nuclear submarine fleet. And he announced a couple of weeks ago now that France is now rethinking the way that it thinks about its nuclear deterrent. And he used this expression, forward deterrence, which nobody knows what it means. And now it's great business for think tankers because they're writing all sorts of things about what he meant or didn't mean. But my point is that one of the things that we think we understand about the war in Ukraine and partly why Russia was able to do what it was able to do is because Ukraine did not fall under the nuclear deterrent umbrella that comes from being a member of NATO, on which the United States provides for NATO. Europeans have that ability. The UK has a nuclear deterrent. It's complicated by the way it's built and maintained, which we could talk about. And the Liberal Democrats, to their credit, are now asking us to think about quite hard, can we build a national nuclear deterrent? As Bevan put it, when he wanted Britain to acquire a nuclear deterrent, we want it with a great big Union Jack on it. That's the Liberal Democrat position. Interesting. I think more Bevan than the Labour Party, more Labour than the Labour Party, maybe on nuclear deterrence. But I raise this. It's an uncomfortable topic to talk about. The means of mass destruction. But Europeans have the ability to do so, and therefore they have the ability to deter if this is something that Russia believes is important to prevent it from pursuing influence through war. So I'm a glass half full guy, despite the fact we're in a really miserable situation in terms of what the current US administration might actually be like. As I say, I think we've got the wealth, we have the capacity, if we choose to do so, to tackle even the most difficult questions when it comes to providing for security and defense and things that we've relied on the US to do for us in the past. But I think we are missing one important thing. You might need to move me on, George. One back. Thank you. Which is, where do we have these conversations? We've got NATO, we've got the EU, right? How are Europeans going to talk about what they want in terms of the architecture to provide for their security, who they want to provide it, how they're going to organize the energy and effort? How are we going to coordinate all of that? Can we do it through the EU institutions? Discuss. Are we going to be able to repurpose NATO without the United States, with the problems perhaps that may arise in terms of decision-making within NATO? Can we repurpose it to our purpose? Where does the EU sit? How does a country like the UK think about the EU being in the driving seat when it comes to security and defence? How are we going to rebalance this thinking that most Europeans have had, that, you know, NATO is the place where you do security and defence and the EU makes a contribution and not. And so there's a sort of active discussion about the idea of us having a European Security Council. That's not like a UN Security Council, but a place in which Europeans take the most difficult decisions when it comes to war and peace. And what we do know, if we look back into our past, those moments in which Europeans have had to fight war together, it's always been as a coalition. Britain and France had to work out how to fight as a coalition partners in the First World War. They put in place all sorts of interesting arrangements to do that. Same thing happened in the Second World War, that the UK and the US had to work out how you were going to organize arrangements to allow you to take decisions about what to do, where, when, and how. And obviously, the power relationship changed there across time. Where are Europeans going to have the discussion? How are they going to do it? And, you know, I've discussed this idea at length in something that I've written recently. Do we need another institution? Or can we actually repurpose the institutions that we've already got for the purpose, the core purpose, I would suggest, now for Europeans to get on the end of? So over to you to let me know what you think and how we should do it. So,
Richard, thank you very, very much for that very illuminating talk, which has taken us through historical perspective and the present perspective, and I suspect left us with more questions than answers. So let's go over to question and answer. Any questions from the audience here to start with? Yes. Hang on, Jane, could you?
So Europe seems to me like a very diverse place. So the United States is one place and currently run by one person and a few other people around him. In Europe, we have huge diversity. We have lots of little nations, each after their own objectives. And then we have, yes, you might want to support Ukraine, but you have Viktor Orban. You know?
yeah.
And you have Serbia, I know it's not part of the EU, but it's quite strong links with Russia. And then you've got Spain saying, we're just not getting involved and we're not going to spend any money on defense. To my mind, that seems like a weakness in the picture that you're relaying as Europe being a unity. We turn that around into being a strength.
Yeah. Just, I mean, you're not wrong, obviously, you know, that clearly, the idea of Europe as a sort of, a hive mind, a single-minded entity, which is thinking about security and defense, is not a reality. I mean, we've relied on the United States. I mean, it's sometimes called as our external pacifier. The United States was there to do the job of keeping the lid on Europeans' disagreements. The remarkable thing about Ukraine and European support for Ukraine is how few non-supporters there have been. The fact that it's really Hungary and Slovakia at the moment, really the only two European states who have put themselves on, apart from Belarus, who put themselves, in a different place. And if you look at the so-called Ramstein process, which is it's a group where Europeans and their allies from outside Europe come together and decide. It's a kind of like Argos for Ukraine. If you really, Ukraine comes along with a catalogue and says, we need all of this stuff, right? And Europeans and others pledge, say, we will help you with that, we'll give you that. That is something that's a remarkable process that's gone on right the way through the conflict. So there has been this extraordinary willingness on the part of Europeans to support Ukraine in that endeavor. So I think, you know, I would point to that as a sort of body of evidence that suggests that Europeans do have the capacity to act collectively if they're clear about what the common purpose is. And let's be honest, you know, the common purpose is fear, because there is a fear that Russia would prevail in the war in Ukraine. And that fear has been enough to bring some countries into NATO, which just didn't contemplate that in the past and believed they could provide for their security and defense on their own. At the same time, it's also led to perhaps some things that we feel more uncomfortable with, you know, with Germany wanting to talk about nuclear deterrent, Poland suggesting that maybe Poland might want to have the option of getting a nuclear deterrent for itself, for example. So, you know, we've got this situation in which we've got all of these things bubbling up. On the one hand, you know, we can point to the fact remarkably coherent as a body of states, and perhaps, dare I say it, made even more coherent because of some of the things the United States has done. You know, I think the Greenland thing has actually had a really interesting effect, I think, on European states thinking quite hard about what they might want to do to allow for the future that they didn't want to happen, which is not to have the United States involved. The problem on security and defense, it takes a really long time to build, to develop and build things. So, you know, if you look at, say, as one indication, Europeans have lots of military aircraft, fighter aircraft. They play all sorts of roles, but basically, you know, aircraft that can do stuff in war. They've got more themselves in Europe than the US has, right? Collectively, they have more than the US. Problem is Europeans keep buying the US stuff. That's the problem. So, you know, and because they're buying things now, like the F-35, you know, which is the aircraft that Britain has on its carriers, we're now locked into, we, Europeans, are now locked into a 30 or 40-year commitment to that airframe because it takes so long. You know, you buy those things for a long, long time. Right? They fly for a long time. You know, that Britain was still flying aircraft 10 years ago, which were, you know, just after the Second World War vintage jet aircraft. I mean, you know, aircraft can have a very, very long service life. And that's one of the things that we've been locked into. Because, of course, we didn't have anxieties about the United States. We thought that it's going to be there for us. And we thought that it was going to be the most reliable partner. And by the way, we thought it would lock the US in to Europe, right? And those are very sensible decisions for European governments to have taken. But now, you know, the extraordinary thing that we're seeing is, I had a slide which I took out because I, you know, knew I was going to bang on for too long, which looks at, I mean, where Europeans are buying military equipment from. There's a downturn in terms of buying stuff from the US, and they're now going to places that they hadn't ever been to before, like South Korea. You know, South Korea has all sorts of contracts now with the Polish government because it's able to sell its stuff that Poland wants quite quickly. We now see in Ukraine is developing capabilities like one of the things that military really exercise about is called deep strike, you know, how you can hit somebody at distance using missiles. It has an indigenous capability which is developed across the course of the war, which other European states want and haven't been able to develop at scale because we didn't think we needed it. And that stuff is really expensive, frankly, to have on the shelf. Europeans don't have a problem in terms of people in uniform. I mean, we've got lots of people in uniform. We've got the ability to generate mass, as it's called. You know, we can have lots of people on the battlefield. Bit of a problem with tanks. The real problem, and I think this is behind your question as well, is what we call the strategic culture. You know, that different countries have different strategic cultures. They think about conflict and the willingness to put people in harm's way in quite different ways. But they're actually, believe it or not, they are lining up now much more than they did in the past. And that's one of the remarkable things that's happened again because of the war in Ukraine, but also is happening at pace, shall we say, because of the United States. So, you know, the US has been incredibly important for securing Europeans. It may end up being really important for securing the future of Europeans in Europeans doing their own security by some of the things that the US has done. So we may be putting up statues to Donald Trump in the future. in some places. Because it does force a mindset shift. And that's where the UK is really vulnerable, of course, because, we've very, very interlinked with the United States, with our nuclear weapons system, our intelligence arrangements, and, for example, the aircraft that we've agreed to procure from the US. So it's you got the bit that would have been in my talk if I hadn't realized I was going to go on for even longer. So I apologize.
So we've got a few questions online from Janet Burgess. What can and should Keir Starmer do, or whoever replaces him?
Do in what sense?
What can or should Keir Starmer do, or whoever replaces him? In other words, what can Britain do?
I mean, I think Britain's done a lot, first off, to its credit, done a lot on Ukraine. But the problem is that we don't possess the means to be the game changer. We can only do what we want to do to support Ukraine in coalition with others. To put it very crudely, I mean, we need the money that Germany is planning to spend on security and defense to make Britain secure. We need the size of the armed forces that Poland is planning to build to make the UK more secure. The UK's got to decide, what do we want to spend our money on that can make the most significant contribution to European security? And it isn't penny packets rather of, a few more tanks or a few more this or a few more that. We've really, I think, got to think quite hard about what we might want to specialize in and what our contribution might be. And you're seeing that a little bit because the UK's very focused with Norway now on the high north, and particularly dealing with Russia there. So there is all of these things are coming out, but we're still very conflicted as to what we might want to do and how we might want to do it, because we're still very rested on the idea that the US is going to do some things for us that the US may not want to do in the future.
Okay, thanks very much. In the audience. Yes.
To what extent do you judge that the dramatic shift in US policy which Trump has introduced is a permanent one? And to what extent do you think any future US president might actually revert, maybe not all the way, but at least partially, to the point where the relationship with NATO becomes a rather more positive one, and perhaps one to which we have become accustomed in the past?
Listen, I think we should live in hope, right? That, future US presidents won't be quite like this president, because we need time. It's a bit like, the situation that Britain faced from the fall of France until the US joined the Second World War. We are playing for time in terms of European security with the US contribution to the European security until we can provide for our own security. Because, the US has signaled for, Obama onwards that they are really worried about China, and China has to be their big focus. And not unreasonably, they think that Europeans should be able to take care of themselves. And I don't think that's an unfair assessment when you think about, our wealth, frankly. And we have been free riders in the past on the United States. The difficult thing now is this sort of transition moment, isn't it, where we've locked into a system which served us in the US very well, but the US is thinking differently about the arrangement, the bargain, if you like, and we can't shift gear quickly enough to allow ourselves to either replace in material terms all the things that the United States is able to provide, or I think in terms of our collective mindset about what we think is the right thing to do. Because, the US was integral to our peace and prosperity. And so for us to suddenly think that the US may not be integral to our peace and prosperity is a really tough rethink for all of us to do. I mean, many people have been instinctive transatlanticists, I think, because we saw that the bet, if Europeans made a bet on the United States, was a very good one and served Europeans very well. And there were other visions available. There was the Gaullist vision, right? Which is, Europe needs to do more itself. I mean, de Gaulle was pretty consistent across time as to what he thought about what would be best for Europeans and how Europeans should best organize themselves. But I think that was, that was a sort of political project that it wasn't possible to prosecute because there weren't the means for Europeans to do that. I think now, the thing is we actually do have the means, but we've obviously decided to focus on other things, not unreasonably. But we didn't quite expect, Russia to wage war on Europe. I mean, none of us saw that coming. And we obviously didn't expect then a US administration because, Biden was with us, as Europeans, he was with Ukraine. We didn't expect that sudden, it's nothing but a complete about turn in the way that the US has treated Ukraine and the way that the US has decided to take another side on that war. So, I think inconsistency in US policymaking is probably a sensible way to approach the United States. And then we could get a nice surprise. But what we also know, I touched on the energy thing, but there are so many other ways that we are so dependent on the United States and becoming more so, if you think about AI, that, it's very, very difficult for us to separate ourselves out from the United States in so many ways in which the global economy is. I've just finished a big project looking at the dollar, the role that the dollar plays in making international relations work, put it very crudely. It is unbelievable how many things are priced in dollar. How, for example, the Chinese, even though they're absolutely desperate to have a competitor currency to the dollar, just cannot make it work, because even when they try and sell their debt internationally, they have to sell it through Hong Kong denominated in dollars. Pork is a hugely important product for China, pork meat, for feeding its population. This basically operates on the basis of the dollar. Pork futures, dollar denominated. If you look at the fertilizer industry, for example, it all rests. The dollar is an amazing thing. I wish I didn't know as much as I now know, and I was as ignorant as I was, 12 months ago about what the dollar, how important the dollar is. The euro, the euro is nowhere, absolutely nowhere, in terms of any area of life that we think is important to our health, our wealth, and our well-being. And I found that more depressing than anything else that I've discovered over the last few years. We can't flush it out of the system, even if we wanted to. And to give one very small example, a real tangible one, where Europeans, I think, were very exposed. All the discussion about what we might do with those Russian assets, which are held in the SWIFT system. The US has representatives on the board of SWIFT. So the US was not going to accept the idea that we might actually take a state's assets and decide to steal them, take them for ourselves and give them to Ukraine. It was not going to happen. And yet, and if you follow the discussion on this, that's why that's completely dropped away as an idea, isn't it? And everything now is about the loan for Ukraine and how the EU is going to fund a loan for Ukraine. And that's, I'm not some sort of swivel-eyed conspiracy theorist. There are locks in that system that make it really difficult for Europeans to do things that they want to do and they think are the first order political commitments they want to make. Sorry, that sounded, I'm in the pulpit, so I get to preach.
I'm quite aware of time.
Yes, sorry.
That's okay, Richard. There are there are 3 more questions online, and I'm sure there are other questions in the room here. But having looked at the time, I feel that we really do need to come to a conclusion.
People can always
You
email me.
keep saying things that raise more questions, which is fantastic because we know that you've got the answers that we would want to have on all these questions. I think we'll come to a close in view of the time. Richard, can I thank you extremely very much for such an excellent talk, and there's a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience and study there. So we do really very much appreciate having you here, and I'd always say come back next year and give us an update. But
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. Thank you for people online.
could I just say so? Thank you very much. I'd like to just say thank you to the audience for coming along and being ardent listeners, and obviously with some questions to ask, and as well as those online, because they were also very interesting questions. That's why I wonder whether we'll see about next year. I'd like to thank the committee for helping this to happen, but technologically, there's been someone sitting there at the back, and he's been sitting there at the back on several occasions since 2022, and that's George. So George, this is a special thanks to him, because next year he'll have to come down from London, if that's at all possible, or it's going to be handed over to someone else. So George, could you just come forward, please? And we've got a little something for you here. He was volunteered by his mother 6 years ago, because thank you. That's maybe possible. We went through a dry run on Friday last week, and we've made copious notes, and I will be referring back to George at some point, you know, George, how do you do this and how do you do that? So it is very important, because I have been in hybrid events and they haven't always been, I would say, as good as this. The church is fantastic. It's got the facilities, and we've got a wonderful, I hope maybe again, wonderful technician. So, and I would love to come talk with many of you here in the audience. There may be a short chance to do so, but committee and Richard, we're off to Coke Brasserie afterwards. So we need to pack up and to move on. So thank you everybody very much for coming along, and hope to see you again, and keep in touch. You probably get my emails or the emails from East Kent. Have a lovely evening.